Hi everyone, I'm sorry for that quick exit. I've been having an error here and I was trying to troubleshoot it, but I wasn't able to. So it looks like even though I get that error message, it's still recording. So we're going to keep going. Thanks for sticking with me. I apologize. All right, so what we were talking about is, this is the video about water. We began talking about electrolytes. Electrolytes, everyone thinks that they know what they are. We know they're in Gatorade, but do we really know what they are? So, electrolytes are charged particles that carry a current. Charged particles that carry a current. You can see we've already talked about two, sodium and potassium. And there are others. There is chloride, Cl negative, magnesium, Mg+, so there's plenty. Now, you might see some other particles that will have a plus or a minus. For example, this is iron. Fe is iron. It does have a minus, so it is charged. However, it does not have the ability to carry a current. Therefore, it is not an electrolyte. It is a charged particle, but it's not able to help our body carry a current. So I just want to point out, it's not every time that you see a plus or a minus is it automatically an electrolyte. But sometimes it is. So the examples I'd like you to know would be potassium and sodium. What is their function? They alter the movement of fluid, and in doing so, help us maintain fluid balance. This is huge. Huge. Huge, huge, huge. Now, we already talked about one example. We said water follows salt. So this is one example of how sodium or salt can help us alter fluid movement. If I move sodium into a cell, guess what is also going to come into the cell? Water. So that's just one example. But as a group, let's just keep it simple. Fluid movement and maintaining fluid balance. Okay, this is saying the same thing. Fluid movement, maintain fluid balance. We wouldn't be able to maintain fluid balance without it. Water, it doesn't have the ability to really know where it's going. So we utilize these electrolytes to kind of pull water in one direction or another. And that really helps us to maintain fluid balance. For example, if you are exercising, you're going to lose some sweat. Maybe I'll use blood. I don't want to use red. It's going to look like blood. She's sweating. Oh, no. Sweating a lot. Well, sometimes when you sweat and you bring in water, that's all you need. You bring in water to replace what you lost through sweat. When would you need to also bring in electrolytes? Only if you exercise for a long time. So let's say we have example 1, where she's sweating some, but she only exercised for 30 minutes. She can drink water only. Gatorade not needed. In 30 minutes, she's likely to sweat some and lose some water. But if she brings some water in, it's going to replenish that, no problem. If you're exercising for 30 minutes, you have enough electrolytes still in your body. Because sure, you will sweat out some salt too. Remember, sodium is in the extracellular fluid, and that's where our sweat comes from. So in a half an hour's time, she'll lose some water and some salt, but she has enough salt to maintain her balance. But in example 2, instead of exercising for 30 minutes, she exercised for 60 minutes. In 60 minutes time, she's going to lose more sweat. Now there's a puddle. And she's going to lose even more salt. Now she's lost enough salt that she's depleted most of her readily available amounts. So water alone is probably not going to be enough. So in this case, she'd want to drink water and bring in electrolytes. If you only brought in water and you had sweated out enough to deplete your sodium, I mean, you never completely deplete it, but I'm saying from where it's available, that wouldn't be good enough, right? So only in exercise that's a long duration would you need to replenish with a Gatorade that contains the electrolytes, right? Only true, though, if it's a long duration. Okay, moving right along. Functions of water in the body. So, number one, it is a universal solvent. That means things easily dissolve in it. Think about a glass of water. If I put Kool-Aid powder or Gatorade powder, it's going to dissolve pretty easily. Shake it up, it's going to dissolve. If I put, there's a lot of things you can put into water and they'll dissolve. Water is a great universal solvent. Things can dissolve easily in it. In our body, we most often see this in our bloodstream. Our blood is 55% water. So we want things to be able to easily dissolve in our bloodstream. Number two, water acts as a transport medium in the bloodstream. If we didn't have the water part of the blood, how would things move? Red blood cells, white blood cells, they don't have little legs, they can't run. So we use water as a transport medium. And as water gets pushed through the vessels, all of the blood cells get a free ride along with it. Water plays a role in sweating, helps us maintain body temperature. So if we lose a lot of water through sweat, we're able, and our core temperature, let me repeat that. If our core temperature goes up too much, that's a bad thing, right? So what happens is your body is going to send water to the surface of your skin. That water actually goes to the surface of your skin and evaporates. And that evaporation has a cooling effect to therefore bring your temperature back down in your core to a safe level. Water can function as a lubricant. Think about your joints. Water is the primary component of something called synovial fluid. And water, there's a thin layer of water that surrounds our brain, around our spinal cord. And in that way, water acts as like a buoyancy thing, and it protects. Your brain is better protected because it sits in that fluid and it's buoyant. All right. We mentioned fluid balance. Let's talk about it a little bit. We're going to try and keep things as simple as we can. The ideal, whatever we bring in, we want to bring out the same amount. If I sweat this much, I want to bring in this much. If I sweat this much, I want to bring in that much. The idea is to match. Whatever your output is, match it with your intake. What are ways in which that we gain water? This is the water intake portion. We gain water through, preformed metabolic. I don't like that word preformed. I think it's unnecessarily complicated. Food and drink. Boom. So we bring in most of our fluid through food and drink. There is a lot of water in food. I mentioned the eggplant earlier. Eggplant has a lot of water content, so it's not just for what we drink, like in water. And then we have some water that is considered metabolic water. And that is, water is, oftentimes when we do a chemical reaction, water is one of the byproducts. So whenever we do chemical reactions, we always produce a little bit of water. It's not very much, but per day, 1.25 cups, it's not nothing either. So make sure you know the two ways we're able to bring in water, food and drink, and then metabolic water. And then know which one is the most. So obviously drink is the most. This is a roundabout for an average adult male, but you don't need to know that exact number. On the other hand, what are ways that we can get rid of water? Well, we can get rid of water through sweat. That is really dependent upon your environment, temperature, humidity, and your activity level. We release a pretty good amount of water through urine. Look at that, about 3.25 cups a day. But again, that's really variable. We release some water in our poop, and then we release some water through exhaling. This should say through water and activity. So these two, urine and sweat, are the most. But again, it depends on the temperature and the humidity outside as well as what you're doing. You don't have to know the exact numbers of each, but which would be the way we release the most water, sweat and urine. Okay, let's talk about regulation. This is a biology course after all. First of all, how do we regulate fluid intake? And it's all about the thirst center in our brain, which is what tells our body and our mind that we're thirsty. That is found in the brain in the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus contains our thirst center. There's sensors all throughout our body, communicates to the brain, tells the brain, hey, we're low on water, hey, we're high on water, and that will therefore dictate what the hypothalamus does. But the hypothalamus is our thirst center, tells us when we're thirsty. Regulation of fluid output has to do with the two ways that we talked about that we get rid of fluid the most: sweating, urine. So the way that we regulate fluid output is the amount of sweat that we release. And then we talk about our kidneys through urine. The kidneys filter the blood and are able to excrete wastes, but also fluid. So if we are dehydrated, do I have an example yet? Let's see. I do have examples. Okay, so we're going to get there. This is saying what we already talked about. Our regulation of fluid intake is by our thirst center in the hypothalamus. This is extra information that you don't need to know. All you need to know is that the hypothalamus is our thirst center. Excuse me. And that controls what we bring in to drink. Regulation of fluid output. In the short term, it's sweating. We can sweat more or less depending on, we can sweat more or less, and that will influence our water balance. Long term, it's all about the kidneys. Woohoo! I would like you to know these two examples, and I'm hoping that they make sense to you. If we happen to have too much fluid, maybe you just drank a whole lot of water, or maybe you drank a whole lot of something else. Not that you would do that, but let's say that someone drank many, many, many beers. Too much fluid. If any of you, not that you would do that, but if any of you have, a lot of times when you drink a lot of beer, you got to go pee a lot. So if we have a lot of fluid, it could potentially become too much. So our kidneys help by releasing more water in the urine. If my problem is too much fluid, one solution is to pee out more water, therefore lessening the amount of water in my body. Then the opposite is true. If you're dehydrated, you don't pee as much. Well, that's on purpose, folks. If I'm dehydrated, my kidneys will automatically retain more water and pee out less. In some ways, it's kind of simple. Hopefully, you're picking up what I'm putting down. Obviously, if it's not equal, we could have problems. If you lose more water than you bring in, could be dehydration. If you bring in more water, that's the wrong one. If I bring in more water that I'm capable of holding on to, you could accumulate excess fluid, and eventually your cells could fill with so much water. Just ignore that, please. Your cells can fill with so much water they'll burst. Now, it takes a lot to get there, but it has happened. All right, some notes on dehydration. Oftentimes, the feeling of thirst lags behind your actual needs. This is kind of a hot topic, especially in the sports world, because what we find is that sweat rates vary so much among people. And therefore, the needs of water vary so much between people, because the more that you sweat, the more water you lose, the more water you're going to have to bring in. So I think this statement is helpful. The feeling of thirst lags behind your actual need. I think this statement is helpful because it just reminds us the importance of drinking. And it's true, you shouldn't wait until you're absolutely thirsty to drink. You should be drinking a little bit throughout the day, particularly if you're doing some kind of physical activity. You should be making it a point to bring in a little bit more. Some dehydration can be even worse. What I do want to point out, if it is a severe dehydration, it's going to mess up that electrolyte balance. We have a normal amount of potassium and sodium. We have a normal amount of sodium inside, we have a normal amount of potassium inside and a normal amount of sodium outside. Well, eventually, if you mess up your water balance, particularly if you get too dehydrated, then salt and potassium are also going to be altered because they move right along with the water. And once you mess up that, folks, oh boy. Once you mess up your balance of potassium and sodium, you're going to really have some nervous system dysfunction. For example, if you mess up those electrolytes, you will have difficulties generating a nerve impulse and contracting a muscle. You don't need to know the step-by-step here, just the idea that if dehydration is severe enough and it alters your electrolyte balance, then you may have problems, nerve impulse generation and contracting muscles. It can be quite serious. Typo there, and fatigue. It can get really bad, right? This is perhaps before your time. When I was an undergraduate in college, it was when Corey Stringer passed away. Summer football camp for the Minnesota Vikings. Big dude wearing pads in the heat, died of dehydration. There's a famous video of Julie Moss at the 1982 Hawaii Ironman. It's pretty retro cool. I'm not sure if this link is still active, but you can just go into probably YouTube and look it up. She literally crawled across the finish line. It's kind of hard to watch, but she is in such severe dehydration that her body is completely shutting down, having difficulties contracting muscles and sending nerve impulses. There's different ways that you could look at to measure hydration. You can measure body weight before and after an exercise session, for example. One easy way is just to look at your pee. What color should urine be? Clear to pale yellow. So if our urine is an appropriate color, it tells us that we are appropriately hydrated. Dehydration, what would your urine look like? Bright yellow, because there's less water. So the solutes that make it colorful, even more bright. Now, if it gets even orange or brown, that's even worse, right? So the yellow I was talking about is kind of a mild dehydration, but if it gets even darker, you're in trouble. Okay, I do want to mention again this water intoxication. Certainly, dehydration is more of a potential problem. However, water intoxication, if you have too much water, it can happen. This happened years ago at Plattsburgh State. there was I believe, men's lacrosse player. They had like the freshman hazing, and all the other men's lacrosse players were drinking beer. And this particular person didn't want to drink beer, but they made him drink water. So he was funneling water, chugging water. Water, 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 water. He brought in so much water. So much water, he died. The water rushed into his cells. They burst. If your cells burst, they cannot do their job, and you could die. So I'm just saying it's happened. Okay, now we're getting towards the end of the chapter here for water. Requirements and sources. It's really hard, right? Everyone's different. I'm going to give you a ballpark. For adults, an adult person needs between 1 and 1.5 mils of fluid per kilocalorie of energy expended each day. If I expended 1,000 kilocalories, and I need 1 mil times 1 mil per kilocalorie, 1 mil times 1,000, 10,000 mils. I convert that to liters. 1, 2, 3. 10,000 mils equals 1 liter. That's very reasonable. Probably a little bit on the low end, actually. So you should know this number, 1 to 1.5 mils per kilocalorie of energy expended. Also, a more general recommendation that might be helpful for you. Most often, an adult male needs about 3 to 4 liters of water a day. An adult female needs about 2 to 3 liters. You know, these 2-liter soda bottles or whatever. That's how I reference what 2 liters is. So usually adult women need about 2 to 3 liters per day of fluid. Adult men need about 3 to 4. Know those numbers. You can break it down. An adult who expends 2,000 calories probably needs how many water bottles? Equal to 4 to 6 17-ounce water bottles. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. An adult who expends more needs 6 to 8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So these are actually, that goes there. This goes here. You don't need to know these. I'm just giving you an example. Okay. I just wanted to make this point that there is some water content in foods. I'm not going to ask you this. I said vegetables and fruits are pretty high. Those probably have some of the highest water contents. I'm not going to ask you this. I'm just giving you a nice little chart. There's different types of water. You don't need to know these. I think it's really interesting, though. You don't need to know those, though. And this is just my little soapbox. Tap water, if it comes from a reasonable place, a lot of places in and around Albany have decent tap water. That's more highly regulated than the water that comes in the Poland Spring bottle. Really, it's more highly regulated. So you have a better idea that the water from your tap is safe than you do the Poland Spring water bottle. And then also, why pay for something you get for free? Just my thought there. Here, this goes to that. I'm not going to ask you about this on an exam or a quiz, but it's there. Okay, good job, folks. Continue on to the second part of this chapter, which is minerals.